which is about the impact of coronavirus. What has it been so far for your institution, and how are you dealing with that? Can I go to you first, Maggie? You're still on mute, Maggie. Oh, okay. Gillian, can I go to you then?
Oh, sure. Here we are. Apologies, I think the host had muted me. Another little technical one. Oh, the joys. And I think, you know, for all of us, I'm sure for everyone listening, this will be true. The impact for our organisations is, you know, physically and technically all the things we're grappling with as leaders and museum people, and that other massive issue, which is about the effect on our people, and the two of those can't be separated. And I think I think it'd be good to talk about our people in more detail perhaps later, but in terms of that impact first on our organisations, I mean, that huge learning curve, when we reflect back the last 10, 11 weeks of that sudden mobilising for people to work from home, getting kit together. And I don't know for all of you, but, you know, our IT team they were the heroes in the organisation. I have to say, of course, they always are, but, they really came to the fore. So all of that sorting out, and then immediately everyone getting engaged in terms of, how can we share our incredible stories and our collections online during lockdown? And again, our people were just amazing with the most incredible ideas. So things like, for our team, and this all came from our team talking to colleagues elsewhere in the sector, doing a joint VE Day virtual festival. We were going to do our own stuff because of lockdown. Our teams just got together and went, let's do something together. Amazing festival, over 300,000 people engaged in it, that range from everything from academic conversations to print and cut out your bunting, and, you know, so, and story time. Those of you again of our age might remember Roy the Rovers. It was one of my must reads. The current chap re-authoring that has authored some storytelling online. So you will all know of this stuff that's happening. And at the same time, of course, we're thinking, how do we reopen now? Let's get into that really detailed planning that I'm sure everybody has got, risk assessments galore, thinking about how we're going to mobilise so that our own people and our visitors are as safe as they can be. And for me, a lot of that thinking is, how can we give that reassurance to visitors? Because we know all that evidence that is saying people are cautious and concerned about coming back. How can we give them that solid, serious reassurance without losing the warmth of our welcome back that we want to give, particularly if we're in PPE? So, you know, I think for me, that impact as all those things and how we're managing it all together. And of course, then the impact for us as leaders, the resilience of organisations, of us as organisations, we're going to be losing about 1.5 million. We're a free museum, but we need people through the door. And it'll be 1.5 million is what we're estimating we'll lose. And that's if we reopen early July, have a relatively steady comeback, but it doesn't include a second peak. So all of that planning is all playing and trying to make sure that we're dedicating time and attention to each one is the leadership challenge. And, you know, more than that, really, I think, you know, really appreciating the amazing work our team are doing and appreciating the different things that are going on in people's personal lives as well as professional lives at the moment.
Thank you for sharing that, Maggie. It is the sort of the way that we've adapted has been brilliant as a sector, I think, and that we've thrown some really amazing content online and engagement as well, not just content. But we have to talk about the challenges as well, and some of those challenges are around the business model or the business models of our governing bodies. Gillian, do you want to come into that next about what the challenges have been and the impacts on your organisation?
Yeah, can I just give a wee bit of context, Sharon, about who we are and how we operate? Because we're not just a museum service. Culture Perth and Kinross is a cultural trust. We're an ALIO that runs the region's libraries and archives services and local history, family studies, as well as museums on behalf of the local authority. And Perth and Kinross is itself, it's one of the biggest regions in Scotland. It's largely rural, apart from Perth City, and we have 3 sites, and a recognised collection of just under 500,000, 500,000 objects. We shut to the public, took the decision to shut to the public like a lot of other organisations did on the 17th of March. Staff were still working for a full week after that until March the 24th, when the doors were closed. We had to secure the buildings and leave, which was hugely difficult and challenging for all of us. Furlough, which I know has affected lots of colleagues across the sector, wasn't an option for us. Given our close working relationship with the council, it was agreed that our staff, apart from a handful of essential staff, would join the others than the council in their pool potentially for redeployment to support the delivery of critical community services during the emergency and potentially after the emergency as recovery begins, which will be a long process. And I would just like to say, picking up on Maggie's point, at this point, I would really like to pay tribute to all of my colleagues at CPK, because I think they've shown remarkable resilience. And as Maggie has said, everyone is dealing with their own family situations as well as working life. And I think the team has shown enormous resilience and provided huge support to each other. So I would really like to just make sure any who are listening or maybe listening later know that it's much appreciated, and they've been brilliant. Normal service for us completely stopped at lockdown, but I think, again, like other organisations and like Maggie has said, we've never been so busy, actually. We set up a series of cross-departmental task groups looking at the different areas of our operation, trying to plan for what needs to happen to ensure that safe and focused reopening can begin. And we're working to a set of assumptions about potential impacts. We've been modelling various reactivation options and phases of reopening, and then attempting to risk assess and cost the likely changes required to ensure safe working can take place. And since its publication at the end of May, we have also naturally been working to the Scottish Government's route map through and out of the pandemic, which has a slightly different timescale from the other nations in the UK. It suggests that museums and libraries could reopen in our phase 3, which will be mid-July at the very earliest, although people will know the Scottish Government is taking a very cautious approach and has been very clear that it will stop the phasing. It will take us back a step if needs be, at any indication that the R rate is rising again.
Thank you, Gillian. And you've raised a whole host of really interesting issues there, because obviously as the Museums Association, we work across the UK. We know culture's a devolved responsibility. As you know, Jill, we've got a Nations Committee and a Nations Policy. So we've been thinking and working with colleagues in Museums Galleries Scotland and with the Welsh Federation and Northern Ireland Museums Council, as well as Arts Council England and NMDC and others, to try and piece all the different bits of the jigsaw together to make sure that the right advice and support is available there for colleagues thinking about reopening and how you manage in the intervening period. And one of the things that I've noticed, actually, which I think is really great, is the solidarity and collaboration between all of those different organisations, no matter if the landscape is slightly different in each country, in each nation. So that's been really gratifying, actually. One of the silver linings of this pandemic cloud above us, that we've come together really well as sector organisations and as museums. So I'll come on to Nathaniel now. You're back with us, which is great. So we're still on that first question, Nathaniel. How have you coped at Charleston from a leadership perspective in terms of the pandemic and the impact on the organisation?
So Charleston is an independent museum, so we are solely reliant on our visitor income, both our tickets to the house and to the garden and to our exhibitions, to our events programme, but also through the shop and cafe. March is always the lowest point in our cash cycle. It's the start of the season. It's when we open the doors and welcome the spring visitors onto the site. And so as soon as we closed those doors in March, all of our income stopped. The crisis has hit us at probably the worst possible time in our life cycle. We had only a year and a half ago opened new Capitol buildings with an exhibition programme, events programme, and last year we doubled our audiences to the site, and this year we were going forward on that really positive journey for Charleston as a really public space. But we now instead find ourselves fighting insolvency, and we have creditor positions, we have all of our festival tickets. Charleston Festival is the third oldest literary festival in England. It's an amazing time where artists, writers, intellectuals, historians, politicians come into our gardens and have amazing interdisciplinary conversations like the Bloomsbury Group did 100 years ago. But it's also our major fundraiser. And all of that income that we had taken, record ticket sales to our festival, are instead tickets that we need to now refund. And so we face ourselves in a terrible position to look after the heritage assets of our site, which is the national treasure, but independently owned, and look after 100 employees, 95% of whom are on furlough leave. And so we find ourselves as a very, very small team making the decisions to save Charleston and to make sure it's there for to reopen whenever that might be.
Thank you, Nathaniel. I think you've summarised there the challenge for organisations in terms of their own sustainability going forward, the challenge for the workforce, which is huge, and that challenge for our communities as well. If we lose our cultural resources, our cultural hubs, our cultural centres, that's going to be a huge loss for generations to come. So that's why obviously we need to think carefully about the future of those organisations. So if we could just, if I could just remind people who are participating online, there's a Q&A function which you should find in Zoom on the menu bar, where you should be able to ask questions. If you put them in now, I can put them to the panel. And there's also a chat function, which I think is open to attendees as well. But either way, you can put questions in there and we'll ask them to the panel. And don't think your question's not important. Your question is as important as anybody else's. So please do that. We were going to also think about, you know, how we have led our organisations in this difficult period. So I think you've all outlined what practically happened, what your governance structures are and what the business model imperatives are now, but how have you acted as a leader and what have the challenges been for you as an individual? Does anybody want to go first on that one?
Sorry, Maggie. I was going to say I'll dive in if you like, just very quickly. So there are a few different things, both about leadership style, I think, and about leadership approach during crisis that I know I'll be taking from this experience. And I've partly because I've been very struck, not just by other leaders in the sector, but I've been very struck by the different types of leadership that have been shown nationally at public and in public and political posts too, which have been really different. And I'll leave it to our delegates to decide which have been the most effective. But I know for me, I've been really moved by seeing the strength of some of them in showing vulnerability in their leadership. Being honest, being courageous enough to stand up and say, actually, I don't have all the answers here, and I may get some of this wrong. But I promise that I will be visible and I will be present and I will be with you throughout this, and then actually following through and actually being there. And I think for me, that style of leadership is very inspiring. It's very personal. It's obviously, it feels empathetic and it feels genuine. And I think for me, in a human crisis like this, it's that sort of human response that I think many of us respond to.
Thank you, Jill. That's a great example, actually. I think we're all looking at leaders internationally and certainly having that conversation about why some women leaders in particular seem to have done well in some nations. And that's an interesting thing to observe at the moment and also to think about once this period is over. Maggie, Nathaniel, did you want to add?
I think, you know, Gillian really articulated that so beautifully, and just building on her point, you know, that the issue about saying, do you know what, I haven't got all the answers, which often is quite a difficult thing to say as a leader. But in response to that, what's really interesting is our people are going, of course you haven't yet. We know we're working on this together. So, you know, for me, one of the learning points is we know our people are fabulous. And I know that's a sweeping statement. But I think at this time when there's all that heightened emotion, and that, you know, people really are stepping up to the mark on it. And, you know, I think one of my learnings as a leader during this period is, you know, again, we know that, or we always say communication is the most difficult thing in organisations and as a leader, and we have to, you know, continue to hopefully meet people face to face, although in this environment we're using these great tools that we've got, and following that up in writing and blah blah blah, and that, you know, one way is never good enough and just once is never good enough in this. And we know that, and we also know that people listen to our conversations with what's playing in their own minds front and centre. So everybody is listening to a conversation through their own different personal prism, depending on our situations. And that's always the case. But again, at the moment, that's heightened because people are, you know, some people are living alone and loving it. And some people are living alone and desperately lonely and struggling. Some of our people are living, looking after children, trying to have conversations and work and juggling, not literally their children. But, you know, and equally, we know some people have got tough domestic situations that they're grappling with. So there's all that happening. There's the fear of losing loved ones and having loved ones that, you know, we're all deeply concerned about too. So there's all that, and there's that worry, because I just find it extraordinary, and I don't know about all of you and people listening, that we have conversations all the time when we ask people about what they're worried about. They don't talk about the personal situation. They're worried about the museum because they care so much about our purpose as museums and the great work that we can do. So people are worried about that. Some people are worried about coming into work. Some people are having to put padlocks on the door and saying you can't come in. So I think my learning as a leader from all that just heightens that issue that we're all individuals and human beings, and one message is never good enough for everyone. We've got to keep understanding the complexities of us as people and be sensitive and thoughtful to that.
I think we've all experienced the corona coaster, as I think it's been called, of ups and downs of emotions, and actually it's really helped when people are honest about that in leadership positions and in any position, actually, to say that it's a struggle and this period is very difficult. Nathaniel, did you want to add anything on that point?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest challenges for me is the fact that so many of the staff team are not working, and I think probably the nation's divided between those who haven't stopped working for 2.5 months and those who are desperate to get back to work and are feeling so shut out from their organisation that they aren't allowed to work while they're on furlough leave, and that presents huge challenges. I think our leadership will be judged at the end of this, but I guess I've felt as much around our peers and colleagues in other organisations, and to Gillian's point about that vulnerability and that ability to talk to others in other organisations and just kind of share the same frustration and fear and kind of sense that, oh God, it's Friday evening again, the Chancellor's made another announcement and we're going to sit and rewrite the cash flow for another weekend, aren't we? And that kind of shared sense that we don't really know what we're doing all of the time, and that this is probably the worst crisis that any of us have been through and hopefully ever will. And we are learning and we're making it up as we go along. And I think the bits of learning I'm taking away from this are things my colleagues and fellow leaders have said to me, including one saying, you know, there will be answers to this, we just don't know what they are at the moment, and that's okay, and they will come in time. But that real importance of being connected, and I've always felt that about our sector, is that it is amazingly supportive, because leadership's pretty lonely sometimes, but actually, yeah, that's why I'm taking part in this session today, because it's nice to sit around with people who are sharing this experience and to be able to do that. And it's such an important part, and it's been so obviously important over the last few months.
Thanks, Nathaniel. We're getting lots and lots of questions coming through now on the Q&A. Thank you, everybody, for contributing. So I'm trying to listen to you and read the questions at the same time and summarise them. A couple of people have asked the panel how you balance being honest and transparent and pastoral care, which we've all talked about to one degree or another, with making really difficult, sensitive decisions. And making decisions about redundancies and delivering, quite difficult, devastating news to colleagues. How do we balance that?
I think honesty is part of making those difficult decisions, and that's both, being honest about how difficult it is, but also being honest about the processes that you're going through, and when you are able to know things and when you're not able to know things. And I think probably the day we shut our doors, we all had people worrying about their jobs, and it would have been wrong to have turned to those people and said, it's all going to be fine. And all we could do is say, we will try our best to make it all fine, but it's not going to be. And I think that honesty comes in, it's even more important in those difficult decisions.
I would agree with Nathaniel there. I think for me, a part of it is about being open about your workings, showing your workings from the very start. You shouldn't be getting to a position where when something dramatic has to happen, something radical has to change, that it's a surprise to your colleagues and your workforce. If you've shared your workings and they've been involved in some of the fundamental discussions about what's happening, what the external influences are that are not in our control, then there's a sense of awareness and a sense that bad news is always bad news, but that honesty and that openness, I think, it goes hand in hand with being compassionate and being as fair as you possibly can be as a leader. It's really important to try and do that as much as possible, and to involve the team in decision making where you possibly can.
Absolutely, as Gillian's saying, it isn't trying to sit in a quiet room and make that heroic leader decision on your own ever. And we were very fortunate when we did our very detailed cash flow and worked out where we were. We decided that actually, if it was a 3 months closure, which we're still hoping it will be, we could afford not to furlough just by making lots of other tough decisions. And we had that discussion with staff early on. I think the thing is as well about having great teams around you. And, my leadership team are immense, but we've also got an amazing business continuity group who are working on the detail. And, I think some of it is about being honest and open, but it is also about reassuring that actually we've got fantastic plans in place. We love planning, don't we, as museum people? And actually we're blooming good at it. And our plans allow that flexibility of the unknown. There are some things that we cannot have control over, despite, wanting to have control over everything. But actually what we've got is a really darn good plan that's a framework that's also flexible and will allow for those different pronouncements. So we won't get everything right all the time, as we keep saying, but we've got a really good plan that we can stand behind and be confident about. And that's because, as you were saying, Gillian and Nathaniel, we've got great people who really know the detail of this stuff, and we're drawing on their immense expertise to be a really good framework plan that we can work from. So I think it's that combination of, I don't know everything, but actually with that confidence that we do know what we're doing as leaders, actually, and we're darn good at it. So it is that combination always, which is a tricky one.
It's a tricky one. I think I'm going to have to go back to the recording of this and take some notes myself, because I think there's some things that I've done perhaps not quite in the right order in terms of transparency and openness in our own organisation, because sometimes you're just in a rush to get things done and it's such uncharted territory. Right, the questions are flying in now. I should say to our participants, if your question is not directly answered in this hour, we will be able to come back to it, and I'll ask the panellists to answer that in writing. And I think there's a way of doing that. I'm sure Rebecca and Simon will be able to tell me how we do that. But a really good question here on what role have your trustees played in supporting your organisations, and have their roles needed to change and adapt? Anybody want to have a go at that one?
Shall I start? So our trustees, and it is, as a board of trustees, they're responsible for of course, the financial health and the running of the organisation. So it's a really key role for us with Archer. And, you know, I'm just thinking back, gosh, doesn't it sound a long time ago to closing day? And, you know, we made the decision to close, actually in partnership with other museums. So we were on the phone talking about closing, and then I was on the phone to my chair of trustees. But making that decision as a leader and knowing that our chair of trustees trusted me as a leader to make that decision, but keep making sure I kept him in touch, because it's really important that he was in touch. Emailing the rest of the trustees to keep them up to date at the right time. But our trustees generally have been really good, you know, in terms of checking we're all right, but giving us the space to do the thinking and planning as well. But equally, we've got some with good specific skills who've been able to help and inject a bit of their expertise that is perhaps less of a trustee and a bit of a specialist advisor almost. And, you know, none of this goes smoothly all of the time, but certainly as trustees, that responsibility ultimately in the health and longevity of our organisation is theirs. And I guess it's that combination, and sort of for me as the chief exec working with our board, that making sure there's no surprises that way either, and that we're up to date and that they're informed and helping where they can.
If I can add to that, in a very similar situation at CPK, our trustees have been super supportive and really helpful in offering their expertise and information about how they're managing, particularly the trustees we have who come themselves from a museums background and willing to share their workings, if you like, about plans for reopening and things like that. But like Maggie said, we've felt it's really important that the trustees are cited on the changes that are happening, and as they have ultimate responsibility, it's really important that they're happy with all of that. So at the moment, my chief exec sends through to the trustees a weekly update to make sure that they're aware of all the major changes that are happening or proposed. They're having a monthly board meeting at the moment to talk through any substantive changes. And there's also a rapid decision-making group that have been set up so that if and when there needs to be a rapid approval in place, then that can happen and it's not held up. So they've been critical to this actually, and very supportive to the wider team.
Thanks, Jill.
Just echoing exactly that, Gillian. I think it's a time where you know that having a very solid, experienced, supportive board is so critical to the health of an organisation at times like this. And yes, having that your rapid response, rapid answer bit, our subcommittee, we've got a subcommittee WhatsApp group now, which I never thought I would have, but that ability to have those very quick checks and to some extent, for me, without a wider SMT in place, they become and take on some of that. But also, yeah, that care, the reassurance, the support, as well as essentially the buck stops there in our particular situation at the moment as well. So it certainly shows the importance of having a very solid board.
Mm-hmm.
Questions about the role of volunteers. So Brian from Aviation Heritage UK says there's a lot of volunteer-run museums with no professional staff. What can larger museums do to help and guide these volunteers run their museums successfully? And then another question about volunteers, I think, coming back into the museum and what responsibility we have to them. Yes, from the Elgin Museum, how reliant are you on volunteers in order to open? As leaders, how responsible or realistic do you think it is to expect volunteers to return? Obviously, volunteers are loyal and willing to return, but many are in the vulnerable category. And how safe can we make it for them? Does anybody want to pick up on those questions around volunteers?
May I start? We've got 400 volunteers at the Royal Air Force Museum, and you know, again, they're immense, and again, many of them are really keen to come back, and we're concerned about them and their well-being too. Many of them are older, if not in the shielding category, nevertheless vulnerable. And our plan, I mean, part of it again is the communication. And, you know, we've just touched on our communications with our people, but only in a small way. And we're doing so many different things to communicate with our paid employees, and it's equally really important with our volunteers. And you know, we're very conscious that many of our volunteers coming to the museum is their whole social life and world, and many of them now are very quick on Teams and social media, but not all of them. So you know, our incredible team have been, we've just got a new volunteer newsletter, revamped that, which one of our volunteers has led, working with our volunteer team. But also, you know, people are ringing around checking that they're okay, and it is just about that ongoing communication. We're really keen to get our volunteers back into the museum when the time's right for them. But in many ways, it's quite similar to the conversations that we're having with staff, because it's about everybody's individual situation in terms of where you are personally, where your household is, and our responsibility to them. And you know, their responsibility, some of them, if they're not in the actual shielding category, who want to come back, how can we support them to do that in as safe a way as we can, perhaps finding things for them to do that is keeping them, you know, more distance perhaps than they would be normally. So thinking all those through is really important. I think Brian asked the question as well, is how larger museums can also support others. And certainly we've been having contact with a number of museums who have been in contact, just sort of touching base with us and finding out, you know, what we're doing. Equally, I have to say, I think we're learning more from them too. So it's always a two-way learning, but certainly I think all of us as museums are talking to each other and learning from each other the whole time. And certainly our sector bodies, which I think we just touched on briefly before, all the learning we've been doing from them has been absolutely extraordinary. But volunteers are so important, and we do really need them, and we'll continue to do so, but we mustn't put them at risk.
Yeah. Again, if I can pick up where Maggie's left off, at CPK, volunteers are absolutely critical. And like the RAF Museum, we've been really concerned, knowing how important coming in and contributing to activities across CPK has been to individual kind of well-being and social life. So we've been very concerned about having to pull back quite a lot of the immediate contact with volunteers initially because we weren't sure that we'd be able to provide the support and management if staff were being deployed elsewhere. And that's been quite critical in thinking about how we pick up our relationships again and how we rebuild. And I think a positive that's come from this for us is that we've started to work with volunteers more remotely, and we're making sure that they're included in opportunities for things like online engagement where that's possible. And again, I don't want to downplay the digital divide and the, you know, awareness that not everyone has access to smartphones or laptops or tablets, and they can't always make contact. And that's something we'll look at in more depth when we go back to full operation. But in the meantime, we're drafting now a survey for our volunteers to ask them, how can we reset our relationship with you? We anticipate a number of them will be concerned about how they can work again with us in the buildings, or how they can meaningfully contribute to CPK's work. And so we're exploring, based on what they tell us, their appetite for things as well, like remote and virtual volunteering opportunities and micro volunteering opportunities. And we're looking at how other museums, particularly volunteer-run museums who have enormous experience in this activity, how they manage to keep communications going in times of crisis like this, because we're really keen at CPK that if there are future lockdowns, and we know, don't we, that there may well be local lockdowns in the future for some time, that everything doesn't just stop, that we have safety nets in place to make sure our volunteers don't feel cut off, that they feel whatever's happening with CPK, they're part of it with us in the future.
Nathaniel, I'm sure you must have a lot of volunteers at Charleston.
We do have about 130 volunteers. I think one of the reasons I'm part of this conversation is to, as I said before, listen and hear what other people have got to say. And I think both, there's a lot in what Gillian's saying, particularly there, that's many steps ahead than where we are in our thinking at this point. But it's the same issues apply for our staff and our volunteers. So everyone has their different sensitivities about what coming back to work might look like. But for us, that's a little bit further into the distance.
Okay, there's a couple of questions that have come through that are really asking about quite detailed questions around templates and how you envisage working with teams, etc., etc. I would say at this point in the webinar that there is guidance being created as we speak on reopening museums, and quite detailed guidance that's been drafted by the National Museum Directors Council and with support from the Museums Association, Association of Independent Museums and others. It's hoped that that will be published within the next couple of weeks. And I know that Museums Galleries Scotland and the Federation and National Museum in Wales are also using that guidance and creating guidance that's applicable in their nations. We'll highlight that on the Museums Association website just as soon as it's ready and do some analysis and some bullet pointing of it. And I know other sector organisations will as well. I'm not going to dip right into the detail here because some of the answers we don't know yet, and some of the answers we're waiting for Public Health England and other equivalents and the Health and Safety Executive to come through with that. And the situation is quite fluid. But we will try and answer those questions and provide links on the chat and afterwards. There's two big questions that I think we've just about got time to wrestle with. And one was a couple of people asked about international examples. So obviously there are a lot of museums in countries where they're further ahead in terms of the curve and the pandemic. And we've all been keeping a bit of a watchful eye on what's going on in countries such as New Zealand and those close to home in Europe. Somebody asked for examples of good practice. I saw an amazing little video clip from Auckland Museum that did its reopening ceremony with its Maori community, and then a beautiful little take round going through the cafe and the galleries of things that you could and couldn't do, and top tips for visitors, which if you just Google Auckland Museum reopening, I'm sure you'll be able to find it online, or we can add it to the detail after this event. But have you been inspired by any international examples, or have you been monitoring what's happening in other countries?
We've been certainly looking at it. As you say, it's because they're a little bit ahead of us. It's really useful to see both what they've done, but also the public's appetite to come back, which obviously is going to differ as well. So I guess not mentioned in specifics, but there's been some really good examples showing online of where people have put things in place, the sort of one-way systems and ways around galleries that have been really thoughtful. And again, for me, it's how we do that in a way that is really clear to help visitors move around, but as also feels like it's appropriate for our organisation. So, you know, let's learn the best from the supermarkets, but also give it a real cultural feel. And, you know, some museums have been doing great things, you know, even from not one that we're going to pick up specifically, but some have done some brilliant face coverings even that you can pick up at the door that were in line with the organisational brand. So there's just been some really creative stuff, but I think much of it from us, and we've learned a lot from sector organisation and sector pieces of work, such as that from the Association of Leading Visitor Attractions, about people's appetite to return. And I think, you know, there's a lot of really useful information there. That, you know, one of the statistics from international museums is that they're looking about 30% attendance compared to pre-lockdown, and that is a statistic to work from for us in terms of planning what that means again for our cash flows and so on is really important. I guess with that I would just lace a layer of every museum's different, and what a museum can do that has really tight spaces and can't socially distance is very different to what others can do with larger spaces and of course more outdoor spaces. So yes, we all learn. I think it's one of the conversations that has happened in the sector that I think will feed through the guidelines that Sharon's talking about, is that it's about sharing the same principles and protocols as a sector, but layering all our different situations that might be about our specific tightness of location, but also in terms of our location, if we're part of a local authority, it'll clearly link into what the local authority is planning, or your local area. So there's differences where we are, there's differences about our spaces, and there's differences to do with our people as well, of course. So you know, certainly there's some really, really good data out there, and it hasn't been about, for me, much of it is about the visitor appetite to return, learning about that, because it's all, at the end of the day, we can put all this great stuff in place. If people don't come back, I think some of the specific lessons as well are about how we give reassuring messages to people before they come. So, you know, our messages on website, great amusing films, but clear films about what people expect. You know, and for me, because for all of us, it's about visitor spend when they come through the door. So, you know, it started making me think, well, if I was going to visit a museum and I didn't know what the offer was, I'd take my own butties with me, frankly. If I'd looked on the website and seen that they've got a great wrapped sandwich offer and they were saying, you know, help us by spending your money with us, then I wouldn't. But if I didn't know that, I'd have taken my sandwiches, and I'd be too tight then because I'd want to eat my... So, you know, I think there's great things about messaging beforehand as well, really clear messaging, and it is about reassurance, and it's all about visitor confidence. And I think that's probably the biggest international message, is all about visitor confidence coming back, and what we can do to reassure people before they come, while they're here, and once they've gone.
Okay.
Sorry, Sharon.
I was just going to move it on to, because we've only got just under 10 minutes, and there's questions absolutely piling through. I would refer people who've asked about the international examples, that there is information on the MA website about what other international museums are doing, and also on the Network of European Museum Organisations website as well as if you look at Ben Mellum, I think he's been providing charts of which museums are opening his consultancy, and I know he's participating and asked a question about international. So there's two big significant questions coming through. One is, what's the significant piece of leadership learning during this crisis so far? I think we've partly touched on that, and the others, which would be nice to finish on, is what will change? What will change as a result of this crisis? What will the sector look like in a year's time, 10 years' time? Do we have to rethink museums? So let's first think about that significant piece of leadership learning. What's the take home so far on that?
I hit a kind of wobble. I don't know at what week it was, but there was a kind of moment where I lost my confidence, and I noticed my board was losing its confidence, and I realised it was because we'd just been talking about the crisis and we had stopped talking about the vision. And I looked back at an email I received on pretty well the day we closed from a leader in a rural museum who has gone through foot and mouth and said that was a disaster and it only lasted a month. You've got something much worse coming your way. Retain strength and a clear vision. And I think so that kind of takes me to the second point, which is what will change is a doubling down on the importance of our vision to us, and a vision for what our organisation is there for, who it's there for, and why we go to work every day. And there has been a shift. You know, we're still battling a kind of, we're fighting the fires at the moment, but we know why we're doing it, and we've got a clear narrative of what we're going to do next. Once we're through this, there will be kind of building that resilience and developing the projects that double down on our mission to be a public organisation, to be an open space for our communities. And it was at that moment of crisis that I remembered what we were doing and why we're doing it, and that's what will change.
Brilliant, thank you, Nathaniel. Gillian?
Yeah, very similar actually to Nathaniel. I think my key piece of learning is in the most difficult 2 o'clock kind of wide awake worrying moments, I am aware, the optimist that I am, that there's an opportunity here, not just to look at how we do things a bit differently, but how we might start over completely in a post-crisis world. And it touches on what Maggie was saying about the visitor experience, and being really clear what our values are, what we can offer that is unique, and thinking about our core purpose and our core audiences. Being really clear about who our key allies and partners need to be, who we serve, what it is they want from us, how we redefine our product or our offer with very limited money we can anticipate, limited public staffing capacity we can also anticipate, and actually limited public appetite for risk and change. So there's a number of different things happening there, but it is an opportunity, I think, to take a deep breath and to be really, really focused on why we're here. Why is this museum here? What is it that we do that no one else can do?
Perfect, thank you, Jill. Maggie?
And just briefly, and again to build on both of those, I had that, you know, we all have heard and joined in those conversations that go, nothing's ever going to be the same again. We're going to have to do everything differently in the beginning, and go, oh, but we've just done a 10-year strategy last year and signed it off. So I did the thing where I got it back out and reread it and think, actually, you know, the strategy, we were very clear, was a framework rather than a tight route forward. And actually having a strategy that, as Nathaniel said, it is a vision that shows where you're going, that actually within that then, it's a framework that we have to perhaps just do things slightly differently to get to where we're going, but we know where we're going. So I will build on both my colleagues there and say it's just about being flexible, but clearly knowing where we are, but being open to new ideas, because we've all learned hugely new things that we can add to our armoury of tools in leading in the future.
Brilliant, and that I think really sort of summarises the conversation so far, and it's one that is going to continue. There's lots more support and resources on the Museums Association website and on other websites as well. We're giving workforce support to our members through various different channels and providing the best up-to-date content that we can. I know from a Museums Association perspective, actually advice can come from unlikely sources. The one thing that I read just sort of on day 2 of lockdown was from our auditors, which I expected to be and the audit will go ahead and you must provide the information, but it was actually some really useful information about what to do in a crisis, and it was about exactly that: focus on your vision, focus on your core, get rid of the extraneous noise, and think about your purpose as an organisation. And that was one of the best bits of advice that I've seen so far. So look outside of museums if you're looking for support and advice as well. We can support each other as a sector. We can be collaborative, we can be collegiate, but there's also a lot of other people in society who are working hard to make the best of this situation that we find ourselves in. So that's bringing this webinar to a close. I've really enjoyed it. I have learned so much. We will try and answer everybody's questions in one way or another. And please do look out for the next webinar, which is on the 17th of June, and which is on a coronavirus conversation and on museums and workforce. Thank you very much.